Snow drifted in slow, wandering spirals that morning, as if the sky itself had grown tired and decided to fall softly to the earth. Evelyn Hart stood at the edge of her porch with one hand braced against the wooden post, listening to the hollow quiet of winter settling deeper into her land. Her breath rose in faint, ghostly ribbons, and the cold pressed through her shawl with the persistence of a truth she did not want to face. She was alone again, and the world seemed perfectly content to leave her that way. The boards beneath her feet creaked, tired from the same long months that had worn her down to a thin, aching version of herself. Inside her cabin lay remnants of a life that had crumbled in too many slow, silent pieces. Her husband's boots by the hearth, their leather cracked. His hat on the peg, untouched since the day a fever stole him from her arms. She kept them where they were, not out of devotion, but because removing them felt like erasing the last evidence that someone had once chosen her willingly. People in town whispered that grief clung to her like a second skin, heavy and unappealing. Sometimes she believed them. Sometimes the silence inside her chest felt too big to carry. Yet winter demanded movement, not mourning. So she wrapped her shawl tighter and stepped off the porch, boots sinking into the soft crust of snow. She headed toward town to meet Clayton Brooks, the man who had hinted, clumsily, almost reluctantly, that he might consider taking her as a wife. It wasn't love she sought, nor even tenderness, just the chance to feel anchored again. To avoid the long, hollow future waiting for a widow with little money and no family. Clayton was practical, well-fed, and uninterested in sentiment. She told herself she could live with that. As she walked, the wind tugged her hair loose from its pins, stinging her cheeks with icy fingers. The town appeared slowly through the white blur. Smoke rising from chimneys, horses tied to posts with their heads tucked low, and a handful of people moving briskly across the packed snow. She breathed through the tightness in her chest and found Clayton standing near the general store, his coat thick and fine, his expression vacant as he scanned the street. When he saw her approach, something in his posture hardened, as if he'd hoped she wouldn't come. Evelyn stopped a few feet away, forcing a small, hopeful smile. Clayton didn't bother returning it. Instead, he gave her the kind of long, evaluating stare one gives a mule they aren't sure they want to buy. The small crowd nearby quieted, sensing a moment worth watching. Evelyn felt heat crawl up her neck, and still she lifted her chin, holding to a scrap of dignity. Clayton finally sighed, shaking his head. "You should have known better, Evelyn. I don't need a life full of problems. Folks say you come with sorrow tied to your skirts, and I'm not looking to inherit trouble." His words were delivered with a casual cruelty, each one slicing through the thin layer of strength she had stitched together. He gestured dismissively toward her cabin's direction. "Go home. You're not what I'm looking for. Not now. Not ever." The onlookers shifted uncomfortably, but no one stepped forward. No one said her name with kindness. Evelyn felt her throat tighten, her heart folding in on itself as though trying to hide from the shame burning beneath her ribs. She managed a nod, small, brittle, breaking, and turned away, each step heavier than the last. Behind her, the murmurs rose again, soft as falling ash. She didn't dare look back. But one person had seen everything. Standing at the far edge of the street, towering above the drifting snow, and wrapped in a long dark coat lined with fur, was Tawa Greyhawk. He had come to town to trade winter herbs and leather he had tanned by hand, moving quietly along the outskirts to avoid unnecessary attention. People often stared at him, his height, his broad shoulders, the quiet intensity in his dark eyes, but they did not speak unless they had to. Tawa preferred it that way. Silence was safer than most conversations. Yet as he watched Evelyn walk away, her shoulders trembling beneath her shawl, something inside him shifted with the weight of an old memory. He knew the look of someone who'd been pushed to the edge of their courage. He knew the ache of being named by others before you named yourself. And he recognized, with a suddenness that tightened his chest, that this woman had endured far too much alone. Evelyn passed him without noticing, her eyes fixed on the snow. He didn't reach out, didn't speak her name, he didn't even know it, but his gaze followed her until the wind swallowed her figure. He saw the strength in her stride, even as sorrow clung to her like frost. He saw the quiet endurance that lived inside her bones. And he saw, unmistakably, that her heart was still fighting, even while the world tried to convince her it had nothing left to offer. The crowd dispersed. Clayton stepped into the store with a shrug. And Tawa remained where he was, breath steady in the cold, feeling the first stirrings of a decision he hadn't expected to make that day. Winter had always taught him that survival required both solitude and timing. But as he turned toward the path leading back to his own camp, he found himself glancing once more in the direction Evelyn had gone, the snow swallowing her tracks. It was then he realized something unsettlingly clear, something that lodged deep and refused to loosen. This winter belonged to her story, but somehow he had been pulled into its center. And whether he meant to or not, he would not walk away from the woman whose quiet suffering had just carved itself into his thoughts. Winter, he sensed, had only begun to speak. Snow still clung to the windowpanes the next morning, frozen in delicate shapes that looked like pale flowers refusing to bloom. Evelyn Hart stood inside her dim cabin, wrapping her hands around a tin cup of cooling coffee. The humiliation from yesterday had settled into her chest like a stone, heavy and unmoving. She tried brushing it away with chores, sweeping the floor, folding linens, tending to the last of her firewood. But everything she touched felt as if it belonged to someone else's life, someone stronger, someone who hadn't just been dismissed in front of half the town. The wind rattled the loose shutter on the far wall. She sighed, rubbing her brow. The roof still leaked from last month's storm, and she hadn't the strength to haul another ladder. Everything required more of her than she had left. She stepped closer to the window to examine the broken hinge, lifting the frame with chilled fingers, when a shadow moved across the snow outside. A tall figure, broad as a doorway, approached with a slow, steady gait. Her breath caught for a moment, instinctively bracing for Clayton or another neighbor looking to offer pity disguised as advice. But it wasn't Clayton. It was the man she'd barely noticed yesterday, Tawa Greyhawk. He paused at her steps, snow dusting his shoulders like scattered ash. In the morning light he looked almost part of the land, quiet, resolute, carved from something older and stronger than the winter pressing on them both. Evelyn hesitated before opening the door, the cold air spilling into the cabin with a hush. Tawa held a bundle of wood in his arms, neatly cut and tied. He didn't speak right away. His eyes, dark as wet earth, took in the fatigue lining her features. "I saw your chimney burning low," he said softly, his voice low and calm, carrying a warmth that surprised her. "You'll need more wood today. Storms coming from the north." Evelyn blinked, unsure how to respond. People rarely approached her without some hint of judgment. His words held no such weight, only simple observation, almost gentle. She stepped aside to let him enter, and as he crossed the threshold she felt a shift in the cabin's air, as though his presence steadied something inside the walls and inside her. He set the wood near the hearth, movements deliberate and respectful, as if he understood the fragile state of the room and the woman standing in it. She watched him silently, her hands lost in the folds of her shawl. "Thank you," she murmured, feeling the inadequacy of the words. "You didn't have to." His gaze lifted to hers. "I know." The simplicity of his answer disarmed her. She found herself studying him more closely. The sharp line of his jaw, the quiet intelligence in his expression, the way he occupied space without crowding it. He didn't stare the way other men did. He didn't measure her worth by her grief. He simply saw her. He noticed the loose shutter next. His brow creased slightly. "Your window's been fighting the wind. If you allow, I'll fix it." Evelyn half laughed, half sighed. "Allow it? I can't seem to stop it from falling apart." He moved toward the wall with a nod, inspecting the hinge with experienced hands. She stood nearby, watching the ease with which he worked, the way his fingers shaped themselves around the tools he carried at his belt. There was strength in him, but nothing harsh. Every motion felt deliberate, thoughtful. As he repaired the hinge, sunlight caught on the strands of his long dark hair, warming the edges of the cold room. Evelyn felt a quiet stirring she couldn't name, something between gratitude and relief, something she had not felt in a long while. She reached for the kettle on instinct, placing it on the stove. "Would you like coffee?" she asked, the words gentle, unsure. "It's not much, but it's hot." He didn't look up, but the faintest shift in his expression suggested appreciation. "Yes. Thank you." When he finished the shutter, he joined her at the small table, sitting with a carefulness that reminded her of someone respecting sacred ground. For a moment they simply sat, listening to the fire crackle. The silence wasn't suffocating like the ones she'd endured since her husband died. This one felt alive, peaceful, like a blanket placed over something trembling. Tawa sipped the coffee, his eyes studying the steam. "Yesterday, you were treated unfairly." His voice carried no judgment, only truth spoken plainly. Evelyn stiffened, heat rising in her cheeks. She hadn't expected him to mention it. "I don't want to think about that," she whispered. "I know," he replied. "But you should not carry shame that is not yours." The words settled inside her with a surprising weight. She looked down at her cup, swallowing the lump climbing her throat. People see what they want to see. A widow with nothing left. Well, I suppose that's a burden no one wants. He shook his head. "You're not a burden." The firmness of his tone startled her. She lifted her gaze to his, and something in the air seemed to shift, like snow catching sunlight for the first time. Tawa held her eyes without flinching, without pity. "You survived loss. You continue to stand when most would fall. That is strength, not weight." Her breath fluttered, fragile as ash. No one had spoken to her like that. Not even her late husband, kind as he'd been. She felt something warm press against her chest, a slow unfreezing. Before she could respond, a sharp gust of wind rattled the door. Tawa set his cup down, standing to look outside. The sky had dimmed, heavy with thick gray clouds gathering along the ridge. The storm he mentioned was already crawling in. "You shouldn't be alone today," he murmured. "The cold will be worse than last week. I'll chop more wood before I leave." "You've already done more than enough," she protested, though her voice lacked conviction. He turned to her again, a small but unmistakable softness touching his eyes. "I don't help because you ask. I help because it is right." The simplicity of the statement made her chest ache. He stepped back into the cold, beginning to chop wood with swift, sure swings of the axe. Evelyn watched through the window, drawn by the quiet power in his movements, the discipline woven into each strike. Snow began to fall again, dusting his hair and shoulders, clinging to him like scattered feathers. He didn't seem to notice the cold. He worked as though winter were merely another challenge he had long learned to face without fear. She found herself leaning against the window frame, unable to look away. This man, who owed her nothing, who knew nothing of her except yesterday's humiliation, was offering her more humanity than anyone had offered in months. When he returned inside, breath thick in the air, he stacked the wood neatly by the hearth. Evelyn felt a tremor of gratitude rise in her, nearly overwhelming. She wanted to thank him again, but the words felt too small. Instead she asked quietly, "Why did you come here today?" He paused, his gaze drifting to the fire before settling on her hand resting on the table. "Because loneliness has a sound. I heard yours yesterday." Her breath caught, a soft, wounded inhale. She couldn't speak. His words had struck something deep, something she didn't even realize was still alive within her. Before she could respond, another knock echoed through the cabin. Sharp, impatient, familiar. Evelyn's shoulders tensed. Tawa's expression shifted, hardening with a protective instinct so subtle, yet so unmistakable that the air in the room changed. Outside, Clayton Brooks's voice cut through the winter air. "Evelyn? We need to talk." Tawa stepped closer as snow swirled behind him and the storm began its descent, and Evelyn realized this moment, this fragile, breathless pause, was about to change everything. Snow spiraled past the window in restless swirls as Clayton's voice bled through the door, sharp and brittle against the quiet haven Tawa's presence had created. Evelyn felt her stomach tighten, a familiar dread rising like smoke. Before she could gather her scattered strength, Tawa stepped forward, his height filling the small cabin with a protective stillness. He didn't touch her, didn't speak, yet something in the air changed, like the moment before a storm breaks, when the world holds its breath. Evelyn opened the door because fear taught her long ago that ignoring trouble only made it louder. Clayton stood on the porch, face flushed from cold or pride, she couldn't tell. Snow clung to the edges of his coat, but he didn't brush it off. His eyes flicked past her shoulder to where Tawa stood, a dark, unmoving figure inside the cabin. Clayton's jaw tightened in a way that made Evelyn's pulse quicken. She stepped slightly in front of Tawa without thinking, though her trembling didn't escape either man. "You sent folks asking about me," Clayton snapped, stepping closer. "I don't appreciate feeling hunted down by a woman who doesn't know her place." Evelyn's breath hitched. "I didn't ask anyone anything," she said softly, her voice thin by disbelief. "I haven't spoken a word about you." Clayton waved her response away as if swatting a fly. "Don't lie to me. I heard you've been telling people I wronged you. That I embarrassed you." His sneer deepened. "Maybe you should remember your station. You should feel lucky I even considered you." Evelyn felt the words sink like ice into her skin. She backed up a step, but Clayton followed, crowding her with the stale smell of whiskey on his breath. Tawa's shadow shifted, silent but heavy with intent. Clayton noticed. He scoffed, looking Tawa up and down with the smug disdain of a man accustomed to safety he never earned. "Should have known you'd hide behind someone like him the moment things got difficult." Evelyn winced, feeling her shame deepen, not for herself but for the ugliness Clayton tried to stamp on others. Before she could speak, Tawa took a single step forward. The movement wasn't loud, wasn't threatening, but it carried the weight of a boulder shifting in a mountain pass. Clayton froze, instinctively understanding the danger he'd stirred. Tawa's voice emerged, low and deliberate. "You need to leave." Clayton scoffed again, but his bravado flickered. "And what if I won't?" Tawa didn't repeat himself. He didn't have to. The silence that followed was thick, ancient, immovable. Clayton looked from Tawa's expression, calm as a winter river but edged with a quiet warning, back to Evelyn, whose eyes no longer held apology. Something in her had straightened, strengthened, drawn courage from the man standing behind her like a silent guardian. Clayton stepped back with a muttered curse, anger folding into embarrassment when no reaction came from either of them. He turned sharply, boots crunching in the snow as he stalked away. Evelyn watched his form dissolve into the swirling white until the cold forced her inside, where warmth and confusion wrapped around her like competing blankets. Tawa closed the door gently. Evelyn leaned against the table, her breath trembling. "I'm sorry you had to see that," she whispered, her fingers twisting in the fabric of her skirt. Tawa shook his head. "You apologize for what he caused. That is his shame, not yours." She closed her eyes, the truth of his words loosening a knot she'd carried too long. When she looked at him again, the room felt strangely brighter, as if the fire had grown without adding a single log. Hours passed in a quiet rhythm, they both seemed to understand without speaking. Tawa repaired the loose hinge on her back door, checked the roofline for weak spots, and brought in more wood. Evelyn cooked a small pot of stew, feeling out of practice offering care instead of needing it. When she handed him a bowl, he accepted it with a soft nod that made something inside her chest warm in a way she hadn't expected. They ate in companionable silence, the only sounds the wind outside, and the slow simmering of stew still warming on the stove. Evelyn found herself studying him again. The steady rise and fall of his breaths, the faint scar near his temple, the calm confidence that seemed carved into his bones. When he finally spoke, it was so gentle it almost slipped past her unnoticed. "You shouldn't have to face men like him alone." "I don't have anyone else," she replied, regretting the words the moment they slipped free. They sounded small, revealing more than she intended. But Tawa didn't react with pity. He met her gaze with a quiet sincerity that felt like a hand placed on a wound without pressing. "You have yourself. And that is not nothing." The sentence arrived like a bomb. No one had ever said that to her. Not even she had believed it. Evelyn looked into the fire, letting the warmth seep into the cracks Clayton's cruelty had reopened. For the first time in months, she felt something steady inside her. A returning sense of self she thought winter had buried for good. Outside, the storm thickened, wind howling across the plain. Tawa rose, intending to leave before the path back to his camp disappeared beneath the snow. But when he reached the door he paused. His eyes drifted toward the small window near her bed, where frost was forming intricate patterns along the glass. He turned back to her, taking in the thin blankets piled on her chair, the nearly empty woodpile, the shiver she tried to hide. "This storm will be cruel," he said softly. "You won't be safe alone tonight." Evelyn's heartbeat stuttered, not with fear but with something she didn't dare name. She swallowed. I've survived worse storms. Yes, he agreed, his voice almost a whisper. But you don't need to survive this one alone. The words hung in the air between them, fragile as snowflakes and twice as luminous. She couldn't answer, not with the rush of emotion tightening her chest. The fire crackled, throwing gold across his face. For a breathless moment, he looked like someone sent by the winter itself. Someone who understood solitude, but who carried warmth beneath all that quiet. Then, from somewhere deep in the swirling white outside, a distant howl rose, long, low, and unervingly close. Tawa turned toward the sound, his expression sharpening. "Wolves don't roam this near to cabins," Evelyn whispered, dread prickling her skin. "They do when something drives them closer." He stepped away from the door, his voice steady but tinged with urgency. "And something is coming." Snow pressed hard against the cabin walls through the night, whispering along the logs like a restless spirit pacing in the dark. Evelyn lay awake for hours, listening to the wind claw at the shutters, but what kept her breath caught in her throat wasn't the storm outside. It was the man sitting near her fire with the stillness of a watchful guardian. Tawa hadn't slept. He sat cross-legged beside the hearth, one hand resting near the knife strapped at his belt, gaze fixed on the flames as though listening to something beneath their crackle. She had offered him a blanket, then her own bed, then the chair by the door, but he refused each with a quiet dignity that needed no explanation. He was here to protect, not to rest. Evelyn couldn't understand why a man who barely knew her would brave a winter storm for her sake, but each time she dared glance at him, she sensed no expectation, no hidden motive, only a calm readiness, as though guarding her was as natural to him as breathing. Outside, the wolves howled again, closer, more agitated, their cries sharp enough to cut the air. Tawa lifted his head slightly, listening, his expression unchanged but alert. "They're being driven," he murmured. "Wolves don't behave like this unless something disturbs their hunting grounds." "By what?" she whispered. The wind answered for him, rattling the door so fiercely she flinched. Tawa rose, crossing the room with a grace that belied his size, and placed another log on the fire. Sparks snapped upward, showering the air with a brief shimmer of gold. When he turned back to her, his voice softened. "It doesn't matter. They won't come near while I'm here." She wanted to believe him. She wanted to lean into that certainty, the way one leans into a warm coat after months of cold. But fear, old and stubborn, tightened her shoulders. "You shouldn't put yourself in danger for me," she said quietly. "People in town don't approve. They'll twist this into something it's not." Tawa regarded her with an unreadable tenderness. Approval from those who refuse to see truth is worth nothing. The simplicity of the statement struck her harder than the cold ever had. As dawn crept in, the storm eased, light filtering through the frosted window in pale streaks. Evelyn finally drifted into a shallow sleep. When she woke again, the fire had softened to quiet embers and Tawa was standing near the door, pulling on his gloves. "The storm's past," he said. "I'll clear the path so you can fetch water without losing your footing." She sat up, still wrapped in the quilt, and watched as he stepped outside into the fresh snow. His figure cut through the morning light like a dark, sturdy pillar against the endless white. She found herself rising, staring at him through the small window, unable to understand why simply watching him made her feel steadier. When he returned, carrying 2 buckets of water and a handful of dry branches, she felt foolishly grateful. "You didn't need to do that," she said for the second time in 12 hours. But the words sounded smaller now, less certain. Tawa set the water down without looking at her. "You shouldn't walk alone on ice after a night like that. Wolves or no wolves, the ground hides its own dangers." She heated the water for tea, her fingers moving clumsily as she tried to make sense of the warmth blooming inside her. No man, not her late husband, not the neighbors, not anyone, had ever treated her with such a quiet, unwavering sense of responsibility. It felt like stepping into sunlight after too many months in shadow. They shared tea in the soft hush of morning. Snow dripped from the roof in slow patterns, like a melody the earth hummed after surviving a long night. Evelyn felt the edges of her grief shifting, loosening, making space for something she couldn't name. She wanted to ask Tawa why he cared, why he stayed, but the words caught in her throat. She had lived her life collecting silences, and now she didn't know how to fill them. Tawa broke the quiet first. "The townsfolk will talk," he said. His tone held no accusation, only a quiet foretelling. "They will twist what they saw last night into whatever suits their fears." She stiffened. "I know. They already do." Then her voice fell, softer. "And I don't want to drag you into that." Tawa studied her, eyes dark and steady. "You didn't drag me anywhere. I chose to stand here. I choose it still." Evelyn felt the floor tilt beneath her, not physically, but inside her chest, where something fragile had been waiting too long for someone to speak to her as he did, with honesty instead of obligation. Later, when the sun pulled itself higher over the horizon, she offered him breakfast. The cabin had never felt so small or so warm. As they ate, she noticed the quiet way he moved, the respect woven into every gesture, the careful space he kept around her. Not distance, but consideration. He was unlike anyone she had ever known. He didn't ask about her grief. He didn't pry. He simply allowed her to exist without justifying her existence. When the meal ended, she stepped onto the porch to shake crumbs from a cloth and froze. Tracks, dozens of them, leading around the back of the cabin. She called for Tawa, her breath catching as he approached. His expression hardened as he knelt in the snow, brushing his fingers lightly over the indentations. "Not wolves," he said. "Men." Her heart thudded painfully. Why would they were watching? Last night. Maybe longer. He rose, jaw tightening. "Someone circled your home while we slept." Fear spread through her like frost. Was it Clayton? Or someone from town? She couldn't imagine anyone lurking near her cabin in the dark, unless they meant her harm. Tawa seemed to read the thought forming behind her eyes. Whoever it was, they weren't brave enough to come to the door. But they will return. The cabin felt smaller suddenly, the world outside colder than it had been an hour ago. Tawa looked toward the horizon, studying the faint hum of smoke rising from distant homesteads. "You shouldn't stay here alone anymore." Evelyn's breath trembled. "I don't have a choice. This is my home." His eyes softened, but his words didn't. "A home is only safe when the people around it mean you no harm." The truth settled heavy in her chest. She had known for months she wasn't welcome in town. She had known Clayton's bitterness ran deeper than his pride. But the tracks behind her cabin told a darker story, one she could no longer pretend wasn't unfolding around her. Tawa turned to her fully then, his expression shifting in a way she had never seen before. Something protective, something decisive. And something else she couldn't name yet, though her heart recognized it instantly. "Evelyn," he said, her name sounding almost reverent on his tongue. "You are not made to live hunted or afraid." She swallowed, unable to speak. His voice dropped to a low, steady murmur, carrying a weight that made the air feel charged. "Pack only what you need." She blinked, confused, breath caught halfway between fear and something dangerously close to hope. "Pack what? Why?" Tawa stepped closer, not touching, but close enough she felt the warmth radiating from him like a promise. "Because you're coming with me," he said quietly. "And I won't let anyone hurt you again." Evelyn did not move at first. Tawa's words lingered in the cold air between them, steady as a hand extended in the dark. Something inside her, a place she had kept braced and armored for too long, softened, then trembled. She looked down at her hands, pale from winter, shaking from fear and something far more dangerous, the hope she had tried so hard to bury. When she finally lifted her gaze, Tawa was still watching her, his expression patient, certain, as if he had already made his choice long before speaking it aloud. She wanted to argue, to say she couldn't abandon the last scraps of the life she had built, even if that life was crumbling. But the tracks behind the cabin, the lingering cruelty of Clayton's voice, the months of isolation and quiet suffering, all of it rose like a tide that would not recede. Her voice cracked as she whispered, "Why me? Why help someone who brings nothing but trouble?" Tawa stepped closer, the snow beneath his boots shifting softly. "Trouble is not what I see when I look at you." His tone held a gravity that wrapped itself around her like warmth poured gently over frost. "I see someone who has carried more than most could bear, and still stands. Someone who deserves safety. Deserves peace." Evelyn swallowed hard, blinking rapidly as tears threatened. She turned away before they could fall, gathering a small satchel from beside her bed. Her hands fumbled with the strap, clumsy from nerves, but each item she packed felt like a quiet farewell to the version of herself she no longer wished to be. Tawa waited near the doorway, not rushing her, not offering to pack for her, simply granting her the space to choose her next breath. When she stepped outside, the cold hit her with startling clarity. The world looked newly carved, blanketed in untouched snow that glittered under the thin winter sun. Tawa walked ahead slightly, scanning the tree line with a protective focus. Evelyn followed close behind, her heart thudding as she left behind the cabin that had once promised shelter and had become instead a fragile cage. They traveled through the forest in silence, the sound of crunching snow becoming a rhythm that steadied her pulse. The wind whispered through the pines, carrying with it faint scents of cedar and frost. As they climbed a narrow ridge, Evelyn's legs wobbled, weakened from worry and the weight of her bag. Tawa slowed, offering his arm without turning it into a question. She hesitated, then rested her hand lightly on his forearm, feeling the solid warmth beneath the layers of fur and leather. His presence grounded her, calming the whirlwind inside her chest. By the time they reached the clearing near his camp, the sun hung low, its pale gold smearing across the white horizon. Tawa had built his shelter far from the town's reach, tucked between ancient firs that stood like silent guardians. Smoke drifted lazily from a small fire pit, and the snow around it had melted into soft, dark earth. Evelyn felt a strange pull in her chest, relief, fear, curiosity, all swirling together like a winter storm finding its shape. Inside the shelter, warmth enveloped her instantly. Animal pelts lined the walls, and bundles of dried herbs hung from wooden beams, filling the space with the scent of sage and pine. Tawa set her satchel down carefully, then lit a lantern that cast a gentle amber glow across the room. "You're safe here," he said quietly. "No one will come near without my knowing." Safe. The word sank deep into her bones, deeper than she expected. Evelyn lowered herself onto a small bench, letting her hands rest in her lap. Her breath trembled in the warm air. "You barely know me," she said softly. "Why risk so much?" Tawa knelt across from her, the lantern light illuminating the planes of his face, softening the strength etched into his features. "I know enough. I know your heart fought for a life that kept breaking. I know you walk with grief that never asked permission. And I know you were left alone when you should have been held." His voice dropped, softer. "You deserved better than the world gave you." Her throat tightened painfully, and she had to look away to steady herself. She had not expected kindness from anyone, least of all from a man who carried scars of his own, scars she could see in the quiet moments when his gaze drifted toward memories he never voiced. Yet here he was, giving her shelter, giving her strength, asking nothing in return. "But the town won't stay quiet," she murmured. "Clayton won't let this go. They'll talk. They'll twist everything." Tawa rose slowly, stepping closer. "Let them talk. Their voices are small. They don't decide your worth. You do." Evelyn felt a single tear slip down her cheek. Tawa reached out with infinite gentleness, brushing it away with the back of his finger. His touch was light but steady, grounding her in a way she had never felt before. Her breath shivered at the closeness, the tenderness, the honesty that radiated from him, as though it had lived inside him for years, simply waiting for the right place to land. She tried to speak, but no words came. Her heart felt too full, too fragile, too overwhelmed by the quiet power in the man before her. He sat beside her now, not touching her, but close enough that their warmth mingled in the small space between them. For a long moment, neither spoke. The lantern hissed softly. The fire crackled outside. Her heartbeat echoed in her ears like a small, trembling drum. Then Tawa inhaled slowly, as if gathering something long held and finally ready to be freed. "Evelyn," he whispered, her name falling from his lips like a vow. "Pack your things." His voice paused, deepened. "Not because you are running, but because I am asking you to choose something new. Choose a life that does not bruise you. Choose someone who sees you." Her breath halted, caught on the cliff of a question she hadn't dared to ask. He turned fully toward her, eyes warm enough to melt any winter around them. "I need a wife, Evelyn. But not for duty. Not for protection. I need a partner." A soul to walk beside mine. His voice lowered to a trembling truth. And you need a husband who will never let you stand in the cold again. The world stilled, the lantern light trembling across the walls like a heartbeat. Evelyn felt the sky shift, the earth quiet, everything inside her rearranging into something new, something fierce, something hopeful. And before she could speak, before she could breathe, Tawa whispered the words that made her heart falter and race all at once. If you choose me, I will spend my life choosing you.